How do we conceive of the nothing?
Yeah, I have literally zero answer for you. Well, my preference on this is I think we just skip the Heidegger entirely.
What the fuck does this have to do with politics? Here's what it has to do with politics. Hello, friends. Welcome to Owls at Dawn. We are just two dudes from Southern California who studied philosophy, politics, and religion around the world and decided to start a podcast where we could bullshit with impunity. I'm Austin Hayden Smith.
And I'm Troy Polidori.
And this week we are going to be picking up our book club, our book duo, our, what did you call it? Our proprietary parliamentary blah, 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 blah.
Something like that. Something about owls.
Something like that. Something about owls. And for people that are curious, because a group of owls is called a parliament, which we figured out like a year ago. So hence the book title.
The Parliamentary Book Club.
The Parliamentary Book Club. So we're going to delve into the first part of Sergei Prozorov's Void Universalism 1 on ontology and world politics. But before we get into that, we're going to start off the episode the way we start off every motherfucking episode, with the Shitty Minute. This is the part of the show where one of us gets to rant and rave about whatever it is that is chapping our hide from the past week. T-Roy, what is chapping your hide?
All right, so my Shitty Minute this week is going to be particularly plebeian compared to maybe what it sometimes is. And I have this experience that is universal and everybody has it, and I know you've had it. And given the fact that both of us, but especially you, have lived in many different places in the world and experienced many different cultures, I'm very curious as to your opinion on this matter. There's a particular way in which you have experiences with people in restaurants, especially wait staff and busboys and et cetera, et cetera. There's a certain way it's done in America that you just grow up with and you expect it. It just seems natural. That's the service with a smile, and the customer is always right, and being nice and congenial and never ever being confrontational or rude or any of that, right? And you grow up with that in America, and it's different in some places. Like maybe in Hollywood, you're not going to get it as much as you're going to get it if you're in like the South of Georgia, right? But generally, it's the case. I mean, if you go to a McDonald's or a Chick-fil-A in Los Angeles, you're going to get service with a smile, right? From like some 16-year-old probably, or increasingly some septuagenarian who's been forced back onto the dole. So you hear a lot of critiques from leftists about how it's actually better the way that it's done in some European cultures, where you're not expected to get service with a smile, and people kind of can be generally rude or at least sort of neutral in their kind of countenance and their presentation. That's just a better way to do it, because having to fake being nice, it's exhausting, and it's really manipulative, and it uncomfortable and makes you feel awkward, all these different things, right? And I definitely have experienced that when I've, been in Europe and lived in Europe, and I'm sure you have too. And it's a pretty stark distinction between what you experience growing up in the States and what you experience in Europe. Two things. One, I'm curious as to what you think of that distinction, and also how it is in Australia, given that you've been there for a little while now. I'm sure you've experienced this. And I kind of feel like I really do understand the criticism, because I hate like doing the fake smile thing. And I remember I've worked retail, I've worked in food service, and when you have to do that kind of fake bullshit smile all day, you come home and your face hurts. Like it's exhausted, especially if you're not someone who generally is like that. And it sucks. Like it's not cool, and it's kind of sort of socially exhausting, right? It kind of, especially if you're introverted, it really just tires you out and makes you need to recharge. But at the same time, I don't like the idea of celebrating like being rude. Like it's actually cool to be nice.
Right.
Yes, you shouldn't force people to be nice. And I don't like the social pressure to be nice. That is bad. I totally agree with that. But I don't think you need to like celebrate being rude as if that somehow reverses it or inverts it or cancels that out. Like we should celebrate. It's okay to be nice sometimes. Like that's not a bad thing. It should just be wherein you choose it to be. I mean, maybe you can't have that. I don't know. But I just don't like this idea that we should like be rude and that somehow is like revolutionary or something.
I feel like this is like your secular John Piperism coming out, right? Like Like you should want to be happy because you understand that happiness is part and parcel of metaphysical realism. And so you don't fake the happiness, but at the same time you shouldn't like celebrate in your unhappiness. Yes?
Dude, if anyone's the secular John Piper, it's you, obviously.
um so no,
You
dude.
you
So
are the
first of
enlightened
all,
hedonist, self-proclaimed.
no, you proclaimed me that, and I just took the moniker. You can't give yourself a nickname. That's super douchey. That's worse than fake happiness. Yeah, dude. I have noticed that. So when I was in the UK, I had a couple of friends in the acting industry who would constantly talk to me because they're trying to emulate a lot of American Hollywood lifestyle. And so they would constantly tell me that they would be like, man, British service is terrible, right? Like, I love the American service. I love the performance. I love the smile. And these are all people who are performers. So, of course, they're going to gravitate towards that. And then growing up myself as a performer, I think maybe that's part of the reason that I gravitated to performance, part of the reason why I enjoy the happiness performing industries, because that's just kind of part of my structural makeup, right? But it can be insidious. There's a book. Did you ever read The Happiness Industry by Will Davies?
No, I've not.
I think it's called the Happiness Industry, and basically it's about he's a political economist in London at God, I want to say Goldsmiths, and this book is all about how happiness is increasingly becoming the measure or one of the important measures that undercuts our socioeconomic systems. So you'll find at these big corporations, they'll have a chief happiness officer whose role as an executive is to organize these and facilitate these happiness techniques and clinics and programs so that workers can maintain their happiness so that they can be better happy workers to reproduce their labor each day, right? Because a happy worker is a productive worker, basically. And so there's a lot of criticism. Some people look at that and they're like, "Yeah, that's good. You should be happy when you go to serve your bagels or when you serve your coffee or when you sit down at your computer and do data entry for 10 hours a day. Yeah, happiness is better." But then a lot of people are saying, yeah, but if you're kind of forcing this affect and this emotion so that you can extract more labor, then you're sort of creating the body as being this producer of this like self-referential producer of happiness that sort of runs us into the ground more by manufacturing these affective and emotional flows. So there's like a problematic element that also undercuts or that kind of fits into this whole discussion.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. Remember, I'm not a huge fan of his, but Chris Hedges had an essay he wrote one time talking about positive psychology as being kind of another form of this, using the corporate sphere to sort of extract additional value, surplus value out of workers through like the social necessity of being happy and thinking positively so as to attract positive outcomes and stuff like that. And I totally get that. I totally agree with that. It should not be a necessity required to be nice on your job, especially if you're in customer
100%.
service or anything like that. But there is a sense in moral philosophy, there's a term that we use, it's called a supererogatory, which just means a duty that's not required. It's not a duty, it's not required, but it's kind of above and beyond the call of duty. It's a good thing, but it's not a required thing. And I think we can conceptually distinguish those things and say there are some things that are good that are not required. And so being nice can be that. So it should not be required and you shouldn't expect it of people. But when you get it, it's the kind of thing you can say, hey, that was actually good and that was a positive thing that happened in the world. So we shouldn't celebrate rudeness necessarily because I don't think that's good. But I think we can celebrate being nice without requiring it.
Yeah. And I think a lot of people, they try to push back and they're like, oh, that fake happiness, fuck that. If I'm grumpy, I'm going to be grumpy. And there is this, especially you get this on certain like leftist circles that like it's cool to be grumpy and moody and like grumpy cat is the meme that a lot of people are like, yeah, that's the leftist attitude. Fuck your fake happiness. And I'm like, homie, really? Like, do we need to be like that kind of reactionary? Because that's just Nietzschean reactive nihilism, right? Like, come on. Or not, which we would call passive nihilism, but it's reactionary nihilism. Like, come on, bro.
Yeah,
we don't need to be
like that.
That's
just straight up Sex Pistols, man. And like, there's a place for that. Sometimes there is a political, I think, an important ethical place for that stuff. But it's like it's pretty minimal. And it's certainly not shouldn't be like your general affect through your entire life. Otherwise, you're kind of stuck in like an adolescent phase.
Well, and as much as I don't want to essentialize the human, I do think that there are tendencies that, let's say, are more optimal, that fit within the random, contingent, but necessary, which we'll talk more about that also as we get into our main segment, the sort of necessary, contingent, or contingently necessary conditions of human experience, where happiness is part of a stimulation of positive affectivity that fits better with what Spinoza would call our conatus, right? So the more that our bodies are kind of attaching to these positive flows, the more that that signals what he would call joy, the more that that signals that our bodies are actually sort of rationally or reasonably, or let's say metaphysically connecting to these various other elements or structures within our lives in a positive way, in a way that is conducive to our optimal flourishing. Now, he wouldn't use the word optimization, and I know that that term gets bandied about in like negative circles, but there does seem to be something that, if there is an essence to the human, however minimal it is, it has something to do with kind of positive flows towards increasing our power or increasing our strength or increasing our joy, which I think are all kind of the same thing. And the sad passions, while useful in certain political domains, for pragmatic purposes, they also seem to maybe minimize that to an extent, right? They minimize your power, they minimize strength, they're reactionary, they're weak. And I don't know, there's something that doesn't seem, maybe we shouldn't just valorize one versus, I don't know, man. I'm a happy guy.
Yeah, you definitely are, dude. You know what this is similar to? This is also another symptom of this disease of grumpiness, or essential grumpiness, is like this whole thing on leftist circles of preferring cats over dogs, because cats are like authentically independent and grumpy and don't give a shit about you, whereas dogs have this like fake bred into them desire to serve and be happy. And it's like, bro, they're both the same. Like, they're both bred into them through nature. And what the fuck do you think we're doing when we're happy? It's no different than dogs. Like, we're just following genetic pre-programming also. So just like be happy that dogs are happy. Like, it's not a big deal. Yeah.
I'm with you though, homie. I do. I like the service with a smile thing. And again, that's because I like that performance thing, but I do dig it. And I will say in Australia, they're much more similar to the Southern California service with a smile. It's not like Georgia or fucking Tennessee, where I think they really mean it. That's the difference. You know, I've heard people say, like, when you go to the Midwest, they think that the Midwest niceness is fake and that people are like underneath, they're like serial killers, that they just want to freak out and kill everybody. And I'm like, I don't know, man. I think that there is a genuine niceness. Like, Canadians are actually nice humans, and Midwesterners are nice humans, and people in the South, like Southern hospitality, I think some of it can be forced, like this sort of religious guilt that gets imposed from above that forces you to be hospitable. Sure, there's an element of that. Nothing is ever all one way or all the other way. But I do think that there is a greater degree of niceness that is genuine in those regions than I think people give credit for. And I think it's wonderful. And Los Angeles, Southern California has that too. Maybe there's a greater degree of cynicism that undercuts that, because a lot of times people are just performing so that they can use you to climb the corporate ladder. I get that. Or to meet the next casting director or the fucking whatever they're trying to do to advance themselves. And Sydney kind of has some of that, because it's got a little bit of the LA affect infused into it.
Yeah, I would 100% agree with that diagnosis, dude. It's kind of a disease that exists, and it's fueled primarily by confirmation bias. I think, like, you find one person who's clearly sneering underneath their smile, and then you kind of judge everybody else by that. And it's just not true. It's not always the case. Some people are just like nice, and it's not a bad thing.
Yeah. And you know what helps with niceness? And this probably fits in with our last week's episode. When you have healthcare and you have like job guarantees and shit like that contributes to niceness.
How about Canadians are nice?
I think so, brother. They have nice teeth, they have nice clothes, they have nice healthcare, and therefore they are nice.
Direct causal line. All right, you heard this here first on Owls at Dawn. All right, so for our main segment today, we're going over part 1, which includes chapters 1 and 2 from Sergei Prozorov's Ontology and World Politics. Last week, or not last week, but the last episode we did of the Parliamentary Book Club, we did the introduction to this book where we talked about world politics and international relations and Prozorov's kind of overall goal, theoretically, what he wants to achieve by critiquing those notions and reconceiving those notions based through ontology, or the study of ontology, study of being itself, primarily. And this week, this episode of the Parliamentary Book Club, we're going to talk about this first part of the book where he begins to sort of set up what the world is and how we can go about deriving what Prozorov is going to call axioms from it. Is that a pretty good intro, Austin?
Yes. As I was reading this, I got like 20 pages into a 50-page or 60-page section, and I remember thinking multiple times, like, fuck, we could probably do a close, deep read on this over just one section of this chapter, because there's so much stuff to cover. You could do a whole lifetime on this, actually. As a matter of fact, I think that's what he's doing. His project in his life now, I think, is going to build from this. But this section seems really dense to me because he talks about Russell's paradox. He talks about Heidegger's ontology. Then he talks about Badiou. Then he talks about Jean-Luc Nancy. Then he talks about some figures within international relations. And so you have all of these debates that are swirling around it, but he does it in a way that actually seems to fit really well in a nicely condensed narrative over the course of about whatever it is, 50 or 60 pages, right? So yeah, it'll be really interesting to see how we proceed through this to get to those axioms. Which he doesn't develop the axioms here. He basically lays the ground to try to then justify how it is that we could build a positive program. But he does that through first exploring this concept of the world itself, right? And then he then wants to say, okay, well, once we redefine what the world is, then we have to understand what politics is within this new configuration of what the world means, which he defines the world as void. And then we can go on and build a positive vision based on this axiomatic universalization of the world and the world as void. And so it's a really interesting narrative, but I feel like there's so much. So how the fuck do you even want to proceed with this? Do you want to kind of just take it section by section, go through?
Yeah, because I think I have some concerns and some worries about particular sections that I wanted to address with you specifically. And so if we just start talking about his three concepts of the world, which is the title of chapter 1, I think that would be a pretty good way to get into it. So the first one, there's three concepts of the world according to Prozorov, right? The world as everything, the world as something, and the world as nothing, or world as void for that last one. And this world as everything, and of course, these are sort of definitions of the world and world politics. What is the world? What is the referent of the world that we're talking about? And so the world as everything is this conception of the world as a totality of every particular thing, or a whole composed of all the beings in the world. And Prozorov is obviously going to reject this notion that the world is everything. And he's going to do this through a series of sort of kind of classical criticisms of totality as a concept. And you mentioned earlier Russell's paradox. This is the most kind of famous one in philosophical, at least recent philosophical history, right? And Russell's paradox is the idea of, can you have sort of consistent set theory without any contradictions in it? That was the sort of goal from Principia Mathematica, right? That Russell wanted to achieve. And so what Russell found was there's a contradiction if you try to develop set theory as an account for entities. And that contradiction is the idea of, see if I remember this correctly, the set of all sets that do not contain themselves as members. That's it, right?
Yes. So basically that you can't have the totality of all totalities, because if the totality means everything that exists, but the totality of everything that exists is also something that exists, then it has to be a part of the totality. It can't be outside the totality that encompasses that totality, right? So if the world is either the sum of everything that exists, or for Wittgenstein, the sum of all meaning, right, meaningful propositions, whatever it is, if that's what the world is, or that's what the totality is, then you have to encompass that, draw like a circle around that, and that's your set, right? But then the question is does that set as a totality exist? You would have to say, well, yes, it does. Then that means that it's necessarily either a part of the world or not a part of the world. If it's a part of the world, then it's not the totality. And if it's not a part of the world, then it's got to be something else. It's got to be an outside world. So you can't have this set of all the sets. And so you run into this potential infinite regress of the world of all worlds, of worlds, of worlds, of worlds. And so you get this potential endless proliferation of sets that exist. So then the question is can you have a world of all worlds, a set of all sets, without running into this paradox? Or will you always run into this perpetual paradox between the totality and then the things that fit within the inside the totality, and then the idea of the totality of all totalities?
Yeah, so just to be clear, there's two different issues here that Prozorov is locating. They're kind of classical issues in set theory, right? One is the idea of Russell's paradox, which is that you cannot have a set of all sets that do not contain themselves as members, because it would both be a member of itself and not be a member of that set, which is a contradiction. You can't entail contradictions, right? It's a reductio ad absurdum. But then also the kind of Cantor's transfinities, I think you're referencing there, right? The idea of the power set always having a greater cardinality than the original set, which then has a power set which has greater cardinality. And this endless proliferation of sets means you could never actually have a totality without something exceeding it. So in two different ways, totality is just inescapably contradictory.
Right. So one is sort of building up, and the other sort of is going deeper, let's say. So can you explain the power set and the idea of cardinality?
Yeah, so I mean, I'm not a math guy. You can correct me here if I'm wrong. You've read a little bit more Badiou than I have. But the basic idea is that a power set is the part of a set containing all the different members, right? That's kind of a part of the original set. But then because it has all those different sets which are within the set, it's going to have a greater cardinality, which kind of just means quantity, than the original set, which just ends up with a greater proliferation of sets.
And then even within the power set, you have sets within inside of that and sets within inside of that to infinity. And so then that means that the sort of cardinality, let's say the intensity, the quantitative intensity of those individual sets exceeds the quantitative intensity of the original sort of quote unquote totalizing set or the outside set. And so there seems to be another problem there as well. So that's kind of what Prozorov is looking at. He's saying, okay, so if the world is everything, if this concept of that we want to presume is that the world is everything, then we run into an inconsistent logical concept. And that's something that needs to be contested.
Yeah, so given this argument that Prozorov is making that you can't think of the world as totality because that entails the idea of there being a totality, and that's inconsistent or contradictory. And you can't have inconsistent or contradictory things. Therefore, via like modus tollens, you can't have the idea of the world as totality. If that's the argument, I have a couple of concerns that I'm not really sure if they really kind of obtain as criticisms here, but I want to run them by you and see what you think. So, first of all, in mereology, there's a pretty distinct separation between thinking of things as part-whole relations and thinking of things as set-member relations. And so what Prozorov's bringing up here with Russell's paradox and with Cantor and all this stuff and Badiou's own use of set theory is thinking of set theory as being kind of like an ontological description of things. That's certainly how Badiou wants to use it, right? And the key is sets and members have a certain relationship to one another. So the members of a set are necessary to the set. If you remove one member from a set, it's not that same set anymore. It has changed. So if you have, the set of all cats that are in this room, then there might be one member of that, right? But if that cat then leaves, then it's now a different set. It's got different members. There's no cats in there. So that member set relationship is one of necessity. Whereas parts and wholes typically don't have that relationship. A whole can change its parts and still be the same whole. Like, for instance, I'm a person. I am a whole made up of a bunch of different physical parts, right? I could lose one of my fingernails and still be the same whole, right? So one of my parts could go missing, and I'd be the same whole, but I'd be a different set of particular objects, even though I'm the same whole. So there's differences between using sets and using wholes. And I get the sense that there may be some equivocation between these two ways of describing things ontologically. Specifically, we're usually talking about the world kind of as being a whole. Certainly, Prozorov says that numerous times. A whole containing all the parts that are in the world, which
Right.
wouldn't be the same as the member-set relationship. You kind of see where I'm going with this? My ultimate worry is if we're just talking about either sets or wholes, when talking about world politics, we're not usually talking about literally the totality of all beings, all things, wherein Russell's paradox would be a problem, and again, only a problem for set theory, not for, part-whole relationships. But we're usually talking about all people, right? Or at least all like sentient beings who are involved in politics. And so in that case, you can have a totality of those things, right? Do you kind of see what I'm getting at with these worries?
Now, why do you think that why does that escape the criticism? Because you're still talking about the world as encapsulating all international, let's say international conceptual relations. So would that be the world? Would that be the totality? Would that still be the globe? And why would that escape the sort of paradoxical relations that he thinks that it does not escape?
Well, am I wrong for thinking that Russell's paradox and Cantor's transfinities in these things are only an issue, only lead to inconsistency and to contradiction for the idea of a totality of everything, every being, not just humans or political subjects or whatever?
So you're saying that it doesn't necessarily seem contradictory because it's not a totality of all totalities, it's just merely a totality. So to think about the world within the framework that international relations wants to do, that Prozorov sees as being inconsistent, logically inconsistent, isn't actually inconsistent because it's not the totality of all totalities, it's just simply a totality amongst other totalities.
Right. And I guess you could say the Cantor's problem still arises because you'd still have the power set of all those, which would then be greater than the original set. So that would still be an issue, right? Whereas Russell's paradox maybe wouldn't be an issue. That's,
Well, maybe
that's a problem for the idea.
Yeah, but okay, but so maybe on conceptual grounds it wouldn't be problematic, but nevertheless, if that's the case, what you're arguing ultimately amounts to the same thing that he gets at, which is that when we're talking about global politics, we're not ultimately talking about the totality of everything. We're just simply talking about a world amongst worlds. And that what he's building is then an ontological disposition that allows us to see that there are worlds within worlds within worlds within worlds. And so conceptually, I get what you're saying. It might not be the case, and I actually have a vague memory of Prozorov and Graham Priest, who is a logician, a pretty well-known American. Well, I think he's Australian, British, but he teaches in America, in New York. Logician who were talking about this precise issue. And then also the idea of how is it that you can just reduce humans to the idea of sets? Like, is that an ontological reduction, or is that something that's valid as well? So this was a debate that was engaged in, I remember, when they were in the same room together. But nevertheless, it kind of ultimately you get at the same thing, that the idea is that you don't have a global concept of totality that encompasses everything, but you have to realize that in order to understand ontology, we're dealing with worlds within worlds within worlds, or sets within sets within sets. And that then kind of changes the way that we understand the ontological ground by which we do politics. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, am I right for thinking just maybe the stuff about Russell's paradox and Cantor isn't absolutely necessary to make his point? And that really we can just say world politics just isn't even about the totality of everything. Like it just isn't. I don't know that we have to prove it logically necessarily. Maybe we would just claim a little too much when we do that, possibly.
Yeah, maybe. But do you think that it is useful? So there's another philosopher by the name of Marcus Gabriel, who's a German philosopher, who talks about this. He wrote a book on it, right? It's something about why the world doesn't exist, but unicorns do, or some shit like that.
Yeah.
And he uses a very similar kind of form of argumentation to argue that the world doesn't exist. And I think that in both cases, it's the idea of getting us outside of thinking totality per se. Because in a lot of political discourses, maybe even unconsciously, I think it's presumed that we understand what cosmology means. We understand everything. And I think he does talk about this, right? He does talk about this sort of like a cosmological ontology. And this is where Russell's paradox maybe becomes most strident. He's talking about these two international relations theorists, one by the last name of Bartleson, and I can't remember the other's last name. But he says that Bartleson kind of assumes this cosmology, that there is a simple totality of all things. And then Prozorov just briefly kind of talks about, the empirical sciences a little bit as well, that also want to talk about the totality of everything, that want to basically say that there is this cosmological ground by which we can understand, a unified theory of all things or whatever. And then in international relations, how that's different from maybe like in physics or something. The reason that that's important is that if you just kind of simply presume that there is this universal cosmological ground that does sort of try to speak metaphysically about what everything is. We are all components within the same universe. Therefore, we should love each other because we're all just stardust, ultimately. That's where Russell's paradox does become important, right? And that's what Bartleson is trying to do, I think he said, is Bartleson thinks that in order to develop this idea of world politics, you have to have some sort of outside by which the world community is able to distinguish itself. So you have like the world versus some sort of outside thing, and then you get into this like friend-enemy distinction, which he later talks about with Carl Schmitt, and then you're able to define yourself in relation to the thing that you're not. So the human community that is different from the natural world, or the human world culture versus nature, or the human world versus the intergalactic world, or the human species versus the alien species, or versus elephants, or whatever. And so you create these distinctions in order to create cohesion within the sort of community that is trying to seek its own sort of camaraderie. And then in that case, that's where he wants to say, well, this is where we can't build a universal cosmology, because then if we're going to try to say that there is some sort of idea of this universal world community that fits within this idea of the universal cosmologies, that's where you run into these paradoxes. Is that not right?
Yeah, I think it makes sense to say at the ontological level, if you're going to use sets as a form of ontology, you can't conceive of a totality without leading to contradiction or to inconsistency. That totally makes sense, and I absolutely agree with that. I guess the issue here is it just seems like that's not necessary to make this ultimate point and can lead to some issues like I've talked about. So like, why not just go down the epistemology route and or like the genealogy route and just say every universal that seems to have existed in the past has always been a particular masked as a universal. And so that's why there aren't universals. I guess that's not really like leading to a contradiction or an absurdity, which is, a deductive, disproof. So it doesn't get you like that absolute certainty that something is wrong. But that just seems to me like the more obvious reason why you can't conceive of the world in world politics as being everything.
Well, and he does do that, right? As he moves forward. That's what he calls nihilism and imperfect nihilism. But I think the reason that he starts off with Russell's paradox is because he's trying to argue against these two maybe prevailing ideas in international relations that he sees, one as falling under the criticism of Russell's paradox, which might be that Bartleson criticism, where you're trying to build a universal cosmology. And then the second one is against, was it Walker? Is that the other person? Yeah, Walker. Yeah. Where Walker then is kind of doing the other one, either the idea that the proliferation of particularities, which we talked about last week, which would just be that you could maybe build to a universal, but it's going to run into the sort of limits, if you will, of the boundaries and things like that. So you just get this endless proliferation of particularities. So then he starts off with that, and then he moves into the three concepts of the world. The world as everything being the first. The world as something is the one that you're kind of talking about, is the idea that, okay, every universal that has existed is just the sort of inflated particularization, right? So the world as everything is one, the world as something runs into those two, where it's just either the radical proliferation of particulars or the inflation of particulars. And then he goes into the next section in this chapter, or maybe it's the next chapter in this section, whatever it is, where he says that, okay, and this is the way that we can frame this is by looking at nihilism, and that you run into the imperfect nihilism, which is what you're talking about. I mean, so I think the reason he starts off with Russell's paradox is because he's trying to answer what he sees as a tendency within IR. So maybe you might just say, well, look, that tendency in IR is already on faulty ground.
Yeah, possibly. Yeah, again, this is not absolutely necessary to his argument. I don't think so. It's a minor point, but
Okay.
yeah, I see what's the point of addressing it at the ontological level first. I get that.
Okay.
So we talked about the world as everything and the ontological reasons why Prozorov thinks that doesn't work, and the world as something we just kind of already talked about a bit, and that's the general idea that every universal is actually a particular masquerading as a universal, so it's more of a hegemonized universal. And he goes through the reasons we talked about kind of last episode that we did on this about why Prozorov thinks that's just not enough to achieve the idea of the world. And while it's good in a lot of cases, say movements like feminism and decolonialism and different particularist movements which try to incorporate some identity group who has been oppressed or expropriated or whatever it is on the world stage, can then sort of make a movement for inclusion in terms of equality and whatnots. And those are good things, right? But they don't actually achieve the end of world politics because they're still just a particular, even if they don't pretend to masquerade as a universal, like the bad kinds, the imperfect nihilistic kinds talked about earlier.
Like some of them might try to masquerade as the universal, and that's a problem because that's just the universalization of the particular. And then some might just throw their hands up in resignation and say, well, we'll never have a universal, so it's just only particulars.
And that's better because you're admitting that you're a particular, so you're not going to hegemonize, right?
Right.
In this kind of masquerading, devious way. But Prozorov thinks, well, that's good. It's not at the stage of world politics. It hasn't yet achieved that. And maybe that's the best we can get. But Prozorov is, obviously he wants to try and reach the stars and see about reviving the universal.
Yeah. And then I think it's important probably at this point to talk about the distinction because he relies a lot on Alain Badiou's understanding of ontology versus phenomenology. And I think at this point, this is where he introduces this distinction. So, I mean, for me, this is actually one of the most interesting parts of Prozorov's argument because it fits really well into a lot of my doctoral research on Sartre's critique of dialectical reason. And so for me, I find a lot of resonance with Badiou's ontological work, which I see as actually trying to provide an ontological foundation for what Sartre's work and what a lot of existentialists and kind of post-Heideggerian, post-phenomenological thinkers were wrestling with. And Badiou comes along and says, okay, those things are all taking place at the epistemological level or at the structural or post-structural level, but I want to develop an ontology that undergirds all of those phenomenological explorations. Did you see that as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's exactly what he's going for. And when I was reading that, I definitely had the same intuition that you were going to perk up at that because it seems very much in line with your work on Sartre's seriality and group infusion and stuff like that.
100%, 100%. So before we get into like inside baseball stuff, which will come up, the distinction in Alain Badiou's work between ontology and phenomenology loosely maps onto these two huge works that he wrote, one called Being an Event and one called Logics of Worlds. And Prozorov's argument in this text is more reliant on Logics of Worlds, but it presumes the work from Being an Event, which was what we've been talking about, this set theoretical ontology. For Badiou, ontology, as Troy said in the last book thing, the sort of commonality of all things that exist, for Badiou is set theory. It's mathematics. Now, what that doesn't mean is as some sort of mathematical realists want to argue, that the ground of all being simply just is mathematics, as though like you scrape beneath atoms and you scrape beneath sensation and what you find are like mathematical things floating through the universe, right? And some people historically in philosophy hinted at this. Descartes argued that maybe ontology ultimately was mathematics. Badiou isn't making that argument. What his argument ultimately is he'll actually ultimately argue that ontology is ultimately void, which we'll talk about moving forward, but that rather the manner in which ontology appears is mathematical, is through set theory, is set theoretical. And what that ends up sort of, I guess, meaning is that there is this distinction between ontology and phenomenology. Now, phenomenology means something different if we're talking about figures like if you're familiar with Husserl, if you're familiar with Sartre or Maurice Merleau-Ponty or Simone de Beauvoir, and people that kind of come out of this tradition where phenomenology was a particular attempt at a scientific approach to philosophy, where you would suspend your lived experience through this process called bracketing, or what Husserl calls the epoche, and you would attune yourself to the experience of the world in such a way where you would be able to analyze it and understand things as they really were in themselves. And it was this scientific approach in his mind. But phenomenology means something different for Badiou and Logics of Worlds. And what that means basically is that phenomenology for Badiou focuses on what Prozorov calls the localization of being as being there, appearances, and the what are called phenomenological indexes, or the transcendental coordinates of a given world. Basically, the everyday identities, everyday experience, the things that we articulate within our phenomenological lives, within our experiential lives. That's what phenomenology is. So when you're talking about going down to the corner to get a bagel, that's a phenomenological experience. When you're talking about the political activities that are going on because of the summit between Trump and Kim Jong-un, that's a phenomenological experience, not an ontological analysis, which is an important distinction for Prozorov moving forward.
Right, and that can be, if I'm right about this, you can correct me if I'm not. Heidegger would have sort of, in a sense, almost reduced what Badiou would call the ontological to the phenomenological. So for Heidegger, the ready to hand, the more phenomenological familiarity or dwelling we have with things in the world is the typical thing of us, and the ontological, or the more mathematical stuff that Badiou wants to talk about, Heidegger would just say is sort of like an aberration. It's not the normal state of affairs. It's not what's typical of us as Dasein. And so where Badiou differs here is he actually is going to say that this ontological realm, where mathematics sort of describes the nature of the world, is real. It exists. And then the phenomenological is sort of an ordering of those things that is always contingent.
Right.
That ordering is never necessary. Isn't his term for it like inconsistent multiplicity, something like that?
Badiou's is, yes. But in Logics of Worlds, it kind of changes to transcendental coordinates, and what Prozorov refers to as transcendental indexing. And what he means by that is that it's the sort of identity functions that appear in a given world. Those are the indexes, right? The categorizations, indexing, taxonomizing, whatever different word you want to use for partitioning particularities within your experiential comportment in the world. That is this transcendental indexing or transcendental coordination of the phenomenological world. It's dividing up the world of phenomenology into these identities, and that is kind of the everyday experience of the ready to hand, maybe, that Heidegger would talk about.
Yeah, so an example I was thinking of, and tell me if you think this illustrates it fairly well. You can think about me as a person, right? And I have all these different parts of me, right? If you use set theory to describe me as an object, you would say that I might be the set of all the different members that we would typically call like parts of me, like arms and legs.
So Troy
and
is the totality, and then the bits of you are the members.
Right, exactly.
Okay.
And I'm just maybe a set of all of those different members. All those members actually really do exist, but Badiou's going to argue, right? But the specific ordering of them in a certain way is what happens at the phenomenological level, or this level of the transcendental coordinate. And there's some transcendental there which does the ordering. Is that the basic idea?
Yeah.
So for instance, I could lose my leg and I would still be me, right? But if I lost my brain, probably we would say that I'm not me anymore. Even though each of those is just a member, right, of that set. So what makes the difference? What says you can't lose a leg, or you can't lose the brain, but you can lose a leg? Well, the transcendental, which says that your identity is fixed by your brain to a large degree, whereas it's not by your leg.
Right. I mean, so yeah, I do think that that this is actually moving on, I think, into the second chapter more so than this current chapter. But yes, I do think that Badiou would argue that. I have a problem with that, though. I actually don't buy that idea. I actually think that if you lost your leg, you are no longer Troy. You are a different Troy. I think that
At the level of ontology.
at the level of ontology, and even I think we should think this at the level of phenomenology, and this is where I actually think that the problem of identity politics is problematic, and I think this is where my ultimate disagreement would be with Alain Badiou's ontology, and this is where I would side more with and Prozorov mentions him, but Jean-Luc Nancy and like Spinoza and Deleuze, because I want to espouse more of a monist ontology of things. But also, I think there's this idea that I'm kind of an occasionalist, I think, where I think that at every moment, like even now, you are a new Troy than you were when we started this podcast, and I am a new Austin. And then now I'm a new Austin from when I just was when I started this kind of banal discussion about how my identity is changing all the time. I think that our identities are at the ontological level always being scrambled, and at the phenomenological, we should recognize that as well, but we don't. And I think the reason that we don't is because we engage in this imperfect annihilation, this negation of the annihilation, the negation of the excess that is always transforming our phenomenological identities and our ontological identities. Does that make sense? Like, in a sense, we're warring against the ontological truths that are disrupting our identities by trying to perpetually index these transcendental coordinates. And I think Prozorov buys this. I think Badiou's second project in Logics of Worlds buys this, and I think and it sort of articulates this, which is why a lot of people actually criticize Logics of Worlds as opposed to being an event, because being an event seemed to be much more realist, whereas Logics of Worlds seems to kind of indicate this more fluid notion of this excess or this radical proliferation of multiplicity that is that they didn't like as much as because it didn't seem to be as grounded in like a sort of absolute realist ontology. Does that make sense, dude? Or am I?
Yeah, dude.
Going off on one?
Your rhizomes are showing though.
Yeah, exactly.
No, I mean, whatever. I know you're kind of on that trip, and we probably differ on that area. But I think as far as what Prozorov's trying to do with this, I think it makes a good deal of sense. Just being the idea that all these different members of the sets do exist. Just their ordering is done in a transcendental way, so that there is no identity at the level of ontology, in terms of pure ontology being set theory and mathematics and stuff. And so that means every identity which exists at the phenomenological level is going to be contingent and can therefore change and has no sort of absolute grounding, which does come to sort of the same conclusion that you're talking about with like the Deleuzian stuff, right?
Right.
That there's always sort of flux and deterritorialization and reterritorialization happening.
Right.
Just there's a different ontology there, but they're still the same when it comes to the level of the phenomenology.
Yeah, exactly. Something is always escaping. There's always an excess. There's always something more than we are articulating, but that there is a tendency at the phenomenological to index, to taxonomize, to categorize, to encapsulate into identities. And so that's the distinction between maybe the ontological and the phenomenological moving forward, I guess. I mean, we've kind of been talking about this. Do you want to move on to another section, or do you... Because this was under the discussion of the world as something. Have we kind of addressed this? We've kind of moved on to another part of the argument, I think.
Yeah, do you want to skip ahead a little bit to the talk about nihilism?
Yeah, I mean, do you first want to just do a brief sort of argument about what he means by the world as nothing?
Yeah, so Prozorov, obviously, he's now discarded the idea of the world being everything. He's discarded the idea of the world being something. So he says that the third concept of the world left is the idea of the world as nothing. And this is his preferred concept. And he wants to say that in contrast to the world as a totality or as a particular masquerading as universal, those first two notions he discarded, he wants to conceive the world as sort of the void where there is nothing there. And so he references back to sort of both Heidegger and Badiou to make complementary points about this. Maybe they're complementary. Maybe you could talk about this when you're responding to Prozorov's idea. But in Heidegger, I guess there's the notion of the world as a clearing where the beings appear. And unfortunately, this is from later Heidegger, which I have not read at all, so I have no idea about how accurate his description of this is.
Yeah.
Do you?
So here's the weird thing, that I actually tweeted this out the other day. I said, in my mind, if someone asks me what I think about Heidegger, my gut instinct is to be like, fuck Heidegger, man. I can't stand Heidegger. And then whenever I read Heidegger, or even people that are commenting on Heidegger, I'm like, man, there's something interesting here. There's something really interesting here. And I think part of it is because I'm so influenced by post-Heideggerian scholarship that they're commenting on things that he was working on. So I kind of like, I almost like see the germinations of things that I find to be quite fascinating in my own studies of like Foucault and Sartre and the existentialists and like Kristeva and things like that come later, and psychoanalytic theory and things like that. So I see the germinations and I'm like, ooh, there is something interesting here, right? But from what I gather, and I'm not a Heideggerian scholar, but from what I gather, having attended billions of conferences and read, secondary literature, and been present when Prozorov was presenting some of his research in a room filled with people who are Heidegger scholars, like Giorgio Agamben and other figures. His elaboration of the later Heidegger seems to be pretty accurate with regards to the idea of the clearing or disclosure of being. And basically, in a very simple sense, the later Heidegger is interested in this idea of being, which is different from beings. So he doesn't mean like the being that is before me, the entity of this lamp that is in front of me, or the entity of this hanger that is before me, but rather there is this grounding that exceeds, or that is beyond, or that is before, or that is underneath, or whatever the sort of maybe spatial metaphor you want to use, that is probably ultimately inaccurate, is that undercuts or that grounds all of the various entities that I'm looking at. And that is what he would call being. So he refers to sometimes the being of beings, right? And a lot of times people translate that with like a capital B for the being and then a little b for the beings. Some people think that that's like an unnecessary distinction. Heidegger obviously doesn't make a distinction between capitalizing in his writings, but his point is that there is some sort of sense in which ontology is the clearing or the disclosure, the illumination, if you will, of that ground that is the foundation or undergirding on which all of the entities, or within which, or through which, or by which all of the entities, the individual entities that we experience in what we might call our phenomenological experience, have their grounding, by which they have their meaning, through which they are shown, upon which they appear. And so there are all these various metaphors that you can use, and there's an intentional reason that these metaphors seem to be a bit unclear, and it's because to actually talk about being as such is very difficult, because as soon as you talk about being, you're imposing beings onto it. You're imposing an identity onto it. And that's why the later Heidegger got really interested in poetry, and that's why Heideggerian scholarship is really interested in these various ways that we can sort of attest to this unattestable thing, or you can attest to this unpresentable thing of excess, right? So that's kind of what's happening in the later Heidegger, is he wants to talk about the possibility of clearing this clearing away or scraping away at the phenomenological experience to get to the disclosure of being itself.
One kind of method that I've learned for interpreting all the incredibly frustrating metaphors that Heidegger uses is to ask, why is he using these metaphors in terms of what is he arguing against? What is he trying to avoid saying? And so, like, if you go back to like being in the world, right, the classic description of Dasein and being in time, one thing that Heidegger is trying to distance himself from is the idea that the world is a totality of objects, a similar idea that we're talking about in Prozorov here, right? Instead, he wants to say that being in the world is more like a familiarity or a dwelling that you have with your immediate surroundings. And those metaphors, dwelling, familiarity, and stuff, are used to avoid the idea of the world as a totality, which is sort of our normal, more philosophical conception of the world. So when he's using these metaphors like disclosure, what is he trying to avoid saying?
He's trying to avoid saying reveal. He's trying to avoid saying identify. He's trying to avoid saying make known. So, and the reason is because disclosure is it's sort of a negative on negative theology in a way. I think it's because any sort of positive ascription to being would necessarily fall under the ontotheological trap, where you are positively ascribing beings onto being, and you're not actually letting being itself appear as truth, or what he calls aletheia, right? Which is the revealing or the disclosure of the truth of being itself. And this is why language is so difficult. This is why when typical philosophical analysis for Heidegger has been very sort of deficient, because it's only been able to talk about beings, the entities in the world, because there's this tendency for language to misunderstand, to misapprehend ontological or the sort of deeper ontological expressions of life or of being, let's say. So that's what he's trying to avoid. He's trying to avoid the positive ascriptions that we generally ascribe to everyday life or everyday lived experience when we're talking about whether it be something as banal as the fan that's in my room right now, or whether we're talking about our emotions in situations of distress, or whether we're talking about politics, right? All of those discourses are positive ascriptions at the level of beings, not allowing being itself to be disclosed. And the tendency is towards one rather than the other. And he wants to try to shift our discursive practice towards the other, to be able to allow for this like poetic utterance of being to express itself.
Okay, and the key point for Prozorov, right, is that this world that is disclosed, that's clearing, excuse me, that is disclosed, is not a being itself, and that's the sense in which it's nothing.
Say that one more time.
So the thing that Prozorov wants to take from Heidegger's notion of being as being disclosed is that it is not this disclosure, this clearing as disclosure is not a being itself.
It is not.
Right.
Well, oh, you mean like an entity?
Right. It's not a being.
Correct.
It is being, but it's not a being.
Right. So the
itself,
world,
but...
yes, the world as nothing is not a being. It is being. It is capital B, being, right? And one way to think about this too, so some people might be thinking, well, what about God? Is God like the metaphysical ground of all reality? You know, there's this debate. Well, according to Heidegger, even when you talk about God as being like the metaphysical ground of all reality, the being of beings, most theological discourse actually still views God as an entity, right? So even like the grandest sort of ontological argument is still trapped within this. We're not talking about the ground of being. We're not talking about that yet. We're still talking about beings and entities. And so Prozorov is trying to say, well, how can we even talk about like this universal? Can we universalize politics without being trapped within this ontotheological tendency? Can we do that? And for Prozorov, the only way you can do that is by clearing away all of these phenomenological identity taxonomized indexes. And you can do that with a little help from Heidegger and then ultimately with Badiou by trying to aim towards that Urgrund is what Schelling would call it, the sort of ground upon the ground. And that's kind of what he's trying to get at. And it sounds kind of esoteric and difficult, but bear with us. This does come together in more like concrete terms here in a minute.
Yeah, we definitely won't talk about Urgrunds anymore. So I think actually this may be my preference is just showing, but I think his use of Badiou right here to talk about the world as nothing is much more easy to grasp.
Yes.
And useful, even practical even. So his use of Badiou to say the world is nothing is to use again set theory in mathematics as ontology. And in set theory you have this notion of the empty set. And it's a general sort of principle in set theory that every single set includes the empty set as part of it. So every single set has the empty set. And when the empty set is nothing, it doesn't have anything in it. It has no members. So it's always a subset of every single set that exists. And so given that, set theory posits that idea, Prozorov wants to use that and say, in that same way, every single world, and these are not capital W world, but small w world, every single positive world that exists, which there are infinity of those, right, has the nothing as part of it. In the same way that every set has the empty set as a subset of itself.
Hmm.
And so he wants to say then that this is a great thing for Prozorov's project, because if the nothing, right, the empty set, is part of every single world, then you have this ground here of nothingness, which is both immediate and non-totalizable. So it's immediate, right, because it's part of every single world. So any world you're in has the empty set or the void inside of it as part of it, a member of it. And it's non-totalizable, right, because you can't then, it's not sort of the totality of all the things, it's the empty set or the void within every single thing, every single world.
Right.
So those are the kind of two goals he wanted to achieve, which the world as everything and the world as something didn't achieve, whereas the world as nothing does achieve those two things.
Mm.
And so he then concludes that following Badiou, every being, therefore, is real, in the sense of every member of a set is real, but its presentation in a world, in a particular world, is contingent. So that's what we're talking about before, about phenomenology is always, and these identities that we find in phenomenology always is being constructed and contingent.
Mm.
And that seems to me to make a lot more sense of the idea of the world as nothing achieving the goals, the theoretical goals that the first two concepts, everything and something, didn't achieve.
Right. Yeah, yeah. Now, I mean, do you think that, I mean, I like, as a philosophical wanker, I like the journey through Heidegger than to Badiou, but do you think that it's necessary? Like, do you think you could just skip the Heidegger stuff and just go straight to the Badiou stuff, or do you think it's necessary to first try to articulate this idea that the nothing is what being ultimately is, and so that, hey, we're not talking about beings, we're not talking about the level of the ontic or the level of the phenomenological, but we're talking about something much deeper, and we need to scrape beneath that, and here's where Heidegger sort of takes us, but Heidegger doesn't go far enough because he can't really articulate the universality of the void in a way that's essentially political, but Badiou does. Do you think it's necessary to go through Heidegger, or do you think he should have just gone, or he could, or one could just go straight to Badiou here?
Well, my preference on this is I think you could just skip the Heidegger entirely.
You do.
But I wonder how much of it is, and I'll ask you this, how much of the use of Heidegger here you think is actually we're getting the materials which we're going to need, the necessary tools that we're going to use to construct the later axioms we'll talk about in the next section of the book, and how much of it is, hey, if I can include Heidegger and Badiou here, I'm getting the two of the major sort of fields in continental philosophy in the 20th century, which are usually opposed. And I'm saying both of them are useful for this project so that I'm not just on one side or the other. Like more of a persuasive case, more of a rhetorical move.
Yeah, so maybe at the academic level, it's a very important move, but at the sort of pragmatic and political level, it's kind of like, okay, you could just distill this down to the Badiou portion of the project.
I'd wonder to ask Prozorov what his take on that. What do you think? That it is that academic, it's going to be necessary?
I think so.
We also have
yeah, I mean, because you can just imagine academics reading this and going, well, he's talking about Badiou and the nothing and the void. He should be talking, and you can imagine Heideggerians just getting all up on themselves. Like, Heidegger first is the one who elaborates the understanding of Das Nichts or, whatever. You can imagine that taking place. So I think in a sense, and this is more of just like a habitual part of academic research and writing as well, is that you kind of have to cover your bases to anticipate potential criticisms.
Yeah, I totally feel that. And we haven't read the whole book yet, so I don't know if Heidegger is going to be more necessary than he seems to be to me right now.
Right. Okay, so we can kind of leave the Heidegger stuff behind, and now we can get into more of the Badiou and building stuff. So now we know what he's trying to do with Badiou, this idea that the world as void is, and can we just talk a little bit about this real quick, this idea of nothing and the void? Because this is where I think, and this is where I get a little uncomfortable. I get a little squirmy here. Because I love thinking about radical multiplicity, which Badiou wants to do. I love thinking about the phenomenological as being contingent, with Badiou, which Badiou and Prozorov want to do. I love so much of this, but I'm not sure, and this could just be semantic, but I don't think so. I think it actually is deeply conceptual, and there is a person that Prozorov distances himself from in this text, William Connolly, who wrote a book called The World of Becoming that actually was extremely influential during my my early doctoral research, which I kind of have built on, which we can talk about maybe a little more. It's not maybe as essential, but for anyone who listens to this podcast, and of course Troy knows this, I tend to be highly influenced by the ontology of Gilles Deleuze. And so this idea of the nothing is something, or the void is something that I'm curious about. So can we talk a little bit about what is the void and what it is not? Like, what is the nothing and what is it not in a positive sense? Like, how can we talk about the nothing as being the ground of being? Because most people think of the nothing as not existing. But this is not that. This is something different.
Right. Are you getting to the idea of your uncomfortability with the notion of a lack?
Yes. But this is interesting because, so that's precisely it, right? We think of nothing as being privation or a lack of something, which presumes that something exists first and then it's taken away. Or it is the kind of the restriction of something, the killing of something. Whereas what for Badiou and Heidegger, the nothing is actually primary that you build on top of. So the stripping away back to the nothing is really just a dissolving of these contingent or maybe artificial phenomenological coordinates. But then what is the nothing? Is it emptiness? Is it just is it like unproductive lack? Is it space? Like, how do we conceive of the nothing?
Yeah, I have literally zero answer for you. I also similarly, I'm uncomfortable. I mean, I really enjoy the distinction that Badiou makes between sort of ontology and his use of mathematics and set theory, and then the bodies and languages phenomenology part.
Right.
I really like that distinction. I don't know about this whole like empty set, void, and lack stuff. Because like, is this an analogy with set theory at this point? Because an analogy doesn't hold just because you can make a claim for it, right? Analogy only holds if the analogs are both similar in the relevant sense. So is there actually a void at the heart of being in the same way there's an empty set for every set? Or, yeah, the analogy doesn't prove that it exists. The analogy only sort of helps explain it, if it exists.
Okay. So here's where I think this ultimately runs. And this is, and practically speaking, for people out there, they're like, what the fuck does this have to do with politics? Here's what it has to do with, here's what it has to do with politics. If the world is void, if that is the ground of all potential political, ontological axioms, right? How the fuck is the nothing productive? How does anything get built off of the nothing? Now, Prozorov will get there. But before he gets there, which I think is, he actually has a really interesting approach to getting there, the way that I like to think of it is this. For Badiou, the void isn't merely analogical, but actually the reason it's void is because if we are going to ascribe any sort of positive identity to the world as void, we're only doing that at the phenomenological level. At the ontological level, you cannot give a positive ascription to it in itself. As soon as you do that, you're making that transition to the transcendental world, right? Not the world as void or the world of worlds. And so the way that I like to think about it is for Badiou, the world as void is radical multiplicity. It's endless proliferation of multiplicity. Multiplicity as potency. Multiplicity as this ground of proliferation of possibility. Now, he might not like that, but that's my like Deleuzian reading of it. Now, he will talk about multiplicity, right? The world as void, or the void of being, this empty set, is a radical multiplicity for Badiou. But the reason that I like to go Deleuzian here is that because then for me it's much easier to understand how it is that that multiplicity is productive, how it actually creates. And the reason is because it isn't lack. It isn't privation, which Badiou wouldn't say, and Heidegger wouldn't say, because that's still speaking at the level of the ontic or the phenomenological. That's still making a distinction between identities, not actually getting to the ground. But still, I just think that there's something problematic conceptually and linguistically that's very difficult to understand. Whereas Deleuze, even if it's just metaphorical, is much more interesting to me because for him, it's about radical power and potency and active creation and forces that are endlessly and boundlessly flowing, that are both before and in excess to these phenomenological identities. So, in a practical sense, that means you're talking about your identity as Troy, right? Or a woman's identity as woman, or someone who is black identifying as part of the black community, or trying to criticize white power structures. Those things are all taking place at the phenomenological level. Those things all take place at the level of indexing, at the level of transcendental coordinates, at the sort of what we might call the second order of ontology. Not ontology itself, but phenomenology, at the level of the ontic. But if we can strip all of that back, we can recognize that your identity as Troy is constantly being confounded by this potency that is undercutting it, and that Troy is just merely the kind of contingent phenomenological analogon of imagination that we sort of impose onto this body that I am communicating with through the interwebs right now, right? And the same works for all identities, whether we're talking about the big identities of a nation state or the small identities of, this cable that's plugged into my phone right now. All of those things are subject to a similar sort of ontological process of scrambling and then recoding, right? And to me, that makes sense within a Deleuzian framework more so than this like Heideggerian, Baudouin framework of just simply talking about the void. And even when he does talk about the void, I'm still thinking about it within that sort of like radical multiplicity of potency in like the Deleuzian sense.
Yeah, so I think I'm actually probably a little bit closer to you on this issue than
Hallelujah!
some of the other ones we previously talked about. Although maybe we'll find a bone of dissension here. I'm similarly uncomfortable with the idea that we previously talked about of ontology being sort of this void idea at the heart of it, or a lack idea. But I'm actually, I don't know that you necessarily have to have that language of negation to make the point that simply at the level of ontology proper, you just have a bunch of real things, right, that actually exist, but all you know about them is that they are things. They don't have any sort of identity, and they're not situated or ordered in any particular way.
Right.
And that a transcendental then comes along and is able to order those things in a specific way. And you just talked about all those examples of different identities, but this can happen with mundane objects too, I think, right? And this is kind of the point that, like in kind of 20th century metaphysics, it's called mereological nihilism, which is just the idea that there are no wholes. There are only like theoretical, or they're only actual like simple things, and that something else has to come along and sort of order them in a particular way to make them into a whole. But that whole isn't sort of real; it's more conceptual,
right?
And so you could look at anything on your desk right now, or if you're in your car and listening to this, and you can see some sort of object like your radio or whatever. It's a conglomeration of a whole bunch of different individual things, which even themselves are conglomerations of a whole bunch of different individual things. And so that can go all the way down to either the simples, if there are such things, or maybe it goes on forever and there's just it's irreducible to any simple thing. Either way, the whole of that thing doesn't exist in and of itself. It has to be sort of conceptualized that way. And there are a lot of arguments against that. But that seems to me like maybe an easier way of thinking about this difference between ontology and phenomenology that Badiou's talking about. And yeah, so there's a sense in which there's a negation there, because you're saying the realm of being and ontology lacks that transcendental indexing,
right,
or ordering, right? So it lacks something that the phenomenological sort of world has, but it's not necessarily defined by that lack, because you could have the realm of being without the realm of phenomenology,
right?
There certainly may have been a time where that was the case,
right?
Perhaps. And you can conceive the world that way.
Well, and even at the world of phenomenology, the ontological is still cutting through it at all times.
Yeah, the same thing Badiou talks about with the void being at the heart of being, right? You could still talk about that realm of being at the heart of the phenomenological world that we all are dealing with every day, without talking about it as a void necessarily, or inherently a negation.
Well, see, this is the thing. This is where I think there's a semantic problem that there needs to be a conceptual clearing, let's say, of a semantic problem, because we think of nothing so much as being a lack of something. But the nothing for Badiou and the nothing for Heidegger isn't lack, right? It's a sort of positive notion of the nothing. It's the ground of being when you strip away everything. But in itself, it isn't a lack of something because that implies that it's distanced from something else. But no, it is just simply annihilation itself. It is simply just radical undifferentiation itself. Like unbounded, undifferentiated, radical proliferation of multiplicity for Badiou, not for Heidegger, for Badiou. And now that is maybe a Deleuzian reading of Badiou, but Badiou and Deleuze, as much as, they are kind of, what do they call Deleuze is Badiou's bête noire, the sort of punching bag that he's constantly distancing himself from. I actually don't think their projects are that different. And there are a few really interesting scholars out there. Brian Smith is one. James Williams has done a lot of work on this, who are actually kind of trying to bridge the divide between certain elements of Badiou and Deleuze. People that I worked with or alongside or have been influenced by quite a bit. And so I think that there's actually a commonality there, but there's obviously also a lot of difference too. But that's it. And that's what's hard to conceive of. But I think that's so important for understanding this, because it's not just simply like nothing itself, as like we think of it as being non-existent.
Yeah, and this is an area you've done a lot more work in than I have, certainly. And I'd wonder, is the split between Badiou and Deleuze less so in this realm of ontology and more so in the sort of Badiou's notion of truth and the sort of post-event?
It's the event.
Mechanisms?
Yeah.
That's way different, right?
Yeah. I mean, I do think that there is disagreement at the level of ontology, but you'll still find Badiou sometimes saying, oh, I like this idea of the radical multiplicity of things and, this differentiation of potency, he says, but, not like Deleuze's idea of power and proliferation and stuff like that. So, but yes, it has to do with the idea of the event ultimately. Which is very different, which actually comes up in the second chapter. And I know we've been going way long here, but do you think we can fly through the second chapter, which is a little bit more concrete here in about 15 minutes?
Well, I mean, what do you think about just doing another episode in the next chapter? Because there's a kind of lot to talk about here.
Yeah,
I kind of want to talk about Schmidt and Rancière and nihilism and all this stuff.
Okay, let's do that. Okay, so then because this is just chapter 1 of part 1, which we thought we were going to be able to do the whole thing, but I had a feeling this would happen. So, okay, so let's wrap up then chapter 1. And I just want to read something real quick. So this is the question that Prozorov then puts forward. How can the void, that is literally nothing, found a politics, and what content could such a politics possibly affirm? And that's it, right? Like, okay, cool. So the concept of world as totality doesn't make sense. World as something doesn't work. It's got to be world as nothing. So great. Nothing is the ultimate ground of ontology. Nothing undercuts everything. In every world, with a small w, not a capital W, but in every sort of context or set, the void is bursting through. So how the fuck do we do politics?
That's the real question. No more talk about grounds and foundations and clearings and shit.
Right. And so what he wants to do is he wants to redefine politics as such on the basis of the world as void. And that's what he does in the next chapter. I feel like we just blue-balled everybody that was listening right now.
If you got to this point, then you definitely deserve some kind of reward.
Yeah. And what we'll basically say is that he does do this. So as Troy said, Troy wants to talk about Carl Schmitt and Jean-Luc Nancy. Yeah, there's no way we could do chapter 2 in 10 or 15 minutes. I mean, it's just too rich, man. But yeah, basically he wants to ground a politics on the void beyond thinking about the international or world politics as has been conceived in international relations and political theory broadly, or political science more broadly.
Right.
Okay. And that's it, right? I guess there's stay.
Well, you know what everyone's reward is.
Stay tuned. What's everyone's reward?
While they're staying tuned for our next episode of the Parliamentary Book Club, they should get a little bit of a lollipop after the dental visit, right?
Okay.
Which will be your sticky leaves, right?
Oh, segue.
So, Austin, we have a sticky leaf segment on this podcast, if you weren't aware. And during this sticky leaf segment, one of us just talks a little bit about what it is that's bringing us meaning in a meaningless universe.
Yeah.
So, Austin, what's bringing you meaning?
So mine is going to be super simple and banal. And I actually had a lovely conversation about it this morning when I was getting my soy cappuccino at my little hipster cafe that's next to my house with the people that are there. And the lady asked me, she said, "So, did you make it to Vivid Sydney?" Now, I briefly talked about this on my shitty minute last week when I was talking about how I was walking around at this event with all these lights and shit like that in Sydney and whatnot. It's this event called Vivid Sydney that goes on for a month where basically Darling Harbour and like the Harbour Bridge and all the ferries and everything are all lit up, blah, 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 whatever. It's not amazing. There's nothing spectacular about that. But there is some sort of event in it that just got me giddy like a fucking 5-year-old. And it was a fireworks show. And I want to talk about how fireworks shows are fucking amazing. And now this will actually fit in with your shitty minute. And I swear we didn't coordinate this. But this is going to talk about how sometimes like the simple shit in life that just makes you happy is beautiful. And I literally, and I even had to tweet about this. Because, you know, there's that meme that's like, by the age of 35, you should blah, 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 blah. So
Yeah.
I actually tweeted out after this fireworks show, and I said something like, by the age of 35, you should still totally lose your shit during the finale of a fireworks show. And I literally, I didn't like verbally lose my shit, but I did let out a couple of woos because first of all, I had a couple of oohs and ahs, like when the fireworks show started. And then I let out a couple of like serious woos because I fucking love fireworks shows, man. There's something just about like a bunch of people sitting there mindlessly watching explosions in the sky in all these weird colors and remember when fireworks shows when we were a kid too, and just imagine for like our parents when they were kids and like maybe their parents when fireworks were just those little sparklers in the streets or like maybe just a little explosion in the sky. Now they got the ones where they explode and then the explosions explode and then the explosions of the explosions like wiggle around like worms in the sky. So you get like an explosion, and then those individual arms each explode, and then those little arms turn into like little worms and like start like drawing these crazy rhizomatic diagrams in the sky, and you're like, whoa, science, man, engineering. I fucking loved it, man. I had such a great time. So I went out on Friday night to this fireworks show, and then they have this little theme park here. It's called Luna Park, where it's basically just a big carnival or fair where it's, you know, little fair games, carnival games, like throw the dart at the balloon or squirt the water into the mouth of the thing or whatever, like that kind of shit, right? Like they had the basketball game, which of course I had to play until I won because I just had to prove that even though it's a carnival game and they rigged them, I could still actually ball a little bit. And so they had that, and then like little carnival games and stuff and rides, and so it's fun, right? But I just had a great time. So I guess my sticky leaves is that sometimes the stupid shit is the real shit, and fireworks shows are amazing, and it's okay to be a little kid sometimes.
You know, I do not share your wonder at fireworks shows, but I do absolutely share the general concept of what you're getting at here, which is that sometimes things are enjoyable, and as long as they don't actually hurt anybody else, don't like shit on them, or else you're kind of a douchebag.
Yeah, do you think, is this the world, is this the void coming through in those instances? Is that it? You know, because he's going to
In
talk
which
about
instances?
these universal axioms, which I don't want to, you know, spoil too much, but he talks about them as being equality, fraternity, or community, and freedom. When I'm sitting there looking at a firework and that joy that like is just bursting out of my core being, is that like freedom of the void that is cutting through that somehow latches onto my emotional experience of this otherwise banal thing? And then I'm also in community with people who are sharing in this thing. And then also we're equal before the fireworks show. Like each of us is an equal participant of this experience. Is that politics?
That's like that meme of the anime guy with, is that politics?
Yeah, with the little butterfly.
Yeah, you know what it is for me though?
Huh.
I don't share the wonder of fireworks, but when a dude dunks on another dude's face, like when LeBron dunks on a dude and like sticks his crotch in that guy's face as he's dunking on him,
Yeah.
that, and then the uproar, like I get up and I throw my hands up and I go, oh my God, that is politics also.
Or when Cristiano Ronaldo has a free kick that he just bangs from like 60 yards out. Did you see that in the game the other day? I'm not a big soccer/football fan, but I enjoy the sport. I've been ripping on it a lot on Twitter over the past week just because I think it's fun to sometimes rip on a sport where people fake injuries as part of their strategy, because I think that's just serious pussy shit. But beyond that, it's actually, I think it's the sport of football itself is really, I think, an awesome sport. I do enjoy it. I think it's a really interesting game. But man, when someone nails a shot and you just see 90,000 people freak out, or when, like you say, when LeBron, did you see like in the finals where he passed it to himself off the backboard and just slammed it home because no one would, I mean, it's like, you're like, oh, this fucking, like you don't even have words for it. It's just like, life somehow bursts forth.
Yeah, finds a way.
And is this just total dude
As the great
shit?
doctor said.
Is this just bullshit? Like, yeah, right? Ian Malcolm?
But it probably is total dude shit, so it's probably not politics.
Yeah, is this like testosterone bullshit? No, okay, but so I was watching this YouTube channel called SciShow, I think is what it's called, and it's like weird like science shit, and the episode was on like why we kiss, right? And apparently, actually, only like 90% of cultures on the earth currently actually kiss. So this isn't something that some people want to reduce it to being like a biological thing, because, you know, bonobos and chimpanzees sometimes will kiss. But they think even that is probably a constructed or learned behavior. But one of the things they did say is it might be constructed or learned, but that actually in the process of kissing, that actually when a man kisses a woman, that his testosterone is actually passed on to her, and that it actually kind of creates, if you will, like a sort of more radical biological and affective connection because of the swapping of pheromones and testosterone and things like that is taking place. So yeah, it's dude shit, but it's like the enhancement, the phenomenological proliferation and enhancement of essential biological functions that have just been somehow captured and encapsulated and then concentrated and then packaged to us.
I don't know, man. That sounds like biochemical assault to me.
It is biochemical assault. Don't pass your testosterone to me. Hashtag consent. But yeah. Which is an interesting segue, because I think next week we're actually going to be doing an episode on that with Heidi Matthews. Is that not correct?
On the hashtag consent?
Yeah, hashtag Me Too and consent culture and sex and stuff like that. So
yeah, that'd be a nice break from talking about grounds.
Yeah, so let's let our brains rest in the meantime. Go out, go see a fireworks show, go watch a basketball game, watch some World Cup, have some drinks with your homies. I know I'm being totally dude-centric right now, so ladies, at me and tell me what I mean, I know you want to watch basketball and World Cup and shit too, but if there's something that I'm leaving out that is part of the human experience that I'm ignoring right now that I need to be better well-rounded in, go do that too. Enjoy your week, and then we'll let this like world Urgrund as void shit digest a little bit.
Yeah, read a non-philosophy book. All right, so is that it for today?
Yeah, that's it, brother.
Alrighty, if you out there could look us up on iTunes, Owls at Dawn, and give us a 5-star rating and a review, that would greatly help with the various mechanisms that get the podcast out to the world. We're also available on Owls
Cambridge
at Dawn.
Analytica.
Yeah, our best friends over at CA. And owlsatdawn.com. Go onto our websites and you can like the episodes, download them there, listen on the inner tubes. And also, you can email us at owlsatdawnpodcast@gmail.com with any questions, and maybe we'll address them.
Yes. And you can also hit us up on Twitter, owls_at_dawn. And I think that's pretty much it. Anything else you got to say, brother?
Just one more thing.
What's that?
Das Vidania, Amerikanski.